Great! Trom just released on NA, and I still haven't made a video on Samurai Remnant's second DLC. Wait for me, Charlie. I'll be there soon. Anyway, Fate Samurai Remnant is one of my favorite works in the Fate franchise, so when I saw that the second DLC would be featuring what seemed like a more in-depth story than the first, I got pretty excited. And making it all the sweeter was the reveal of a younger Yagyu Munenori. I love seeing different versions of servants we've already seen, so I was intrigued to see how this aged swordman would act with a bit of youth in him. So, our question is, did it live up to my expectations? Not really! Although that's not a very satisfying answer, so let's take a deeper look into Samurai Remnant's second DLC, the Yagyu Sword Chronicles, to find out why it disappointed me. We open with Iori and Saber waiting to meet up with Tsukinoshin. Instead, though, they're greeted by Kakunoshin, a magistrate who's the other guy's superior. He tells the pair that a serial killer has been going around murdering officials in the streets, and that Tsukinoshin is in Ueno to investigate. Realizing that Iori's the Ronin who does work for the constable, the magistrate goads him into going to help with the investigation. As our heroes head off, Kakunoshin watches them suspiciously from the shadows. Once they find our favorite cowardly constable, he tells them that whoever the killer is, he is one hell of a swordsman. Even a guy like him can tell that they must be on the level of a sword saint. Being the battle-hungry loon he is, Iori immediately decides that he is definitely helping with this case. The pair go to question the townspeople, but all that does is get us chasing a red herring, leading us to find and catch a thief. After turning the man in, they decide to meet up with Tsukinoshin and Yoshiwara the next day. But before returning home, however, they run into Musashi, who happened to also be chasing something down in Ueno. Though, in her case, she's just looking for some good grub. After telling Musashi about the killer, she rushes off after the rice she's craving. With his master gone, Iori tells Saber about the Sword Saints, legendary swordsmen that by this point had all died or disappeared. Their discussion is cut short, though, by a scream, and the two run off to see what happened. They find the corpse of another official, one that Saber senses magical energy on. Realizing that the killer isn't human, the two are about to leave when several constables show up. With no witnesses around to vouch with him, Iori gets pinned for the murder and flees before he can be arrested, saying that Tsukinoshin can vouch for his innocence. As Iori ponders the effects that being a wanted man will have on Gaia, they are attacked by monsters that they quickly rule out as suspects on account of them being really weak. After wiping the floor with the monsters, they decide to go home to Riku and tell Jing about the situation. But on the way out of Ueno, they run into a heroic spirit who suddenly attacks them. Iori ignores Saber's warning to keep out of the fight and rushes the man, but quickly gets beaten. As Saber calls out his name, the spirit seems to recognize it and sheathes his blade. He introduces himself as Yagyu Munenori, one of the sword saints Iori mentioned earlier. He apologizes for prematurely pulling his blade on him, and they question him about the murder that night, and he denies being involved. In order to clear his name and catch the killer, Iori proposes that they team up. After filling him in on what they know, the rogue Saber agrees to help them. Once Munenori realizes that the young man is in fact the student of renowned Miyamoto Musashi, he quietly comments that this must be fate, and the three agree to meet up in Yoshiwara the next day. The next morning, after informing Zhang of what's happening, Kaya shows up to warn Iori about the many people outside waiting to arrest him. Among them is Kakunoshin, who claims that he always suspected Iori of being the killer. Iori takes a single step forward trying to explain himself, which is enough to make the magistrate shit himself, and he orders the swordsman with him to arrest the Ronin. During the fight, Iori realizes that all the swordsmen fight the exact same. Rather than realize he's dealing with faceless mobs, not unlike that he's had to deal with countless times in this game already, he decides that this time, everyone fighting the same way is odd and adds it to the mystery pile. As he and Saber flee, Kakunoshin orders them to be followed before commenting that if things keep going this way, he'll be found out, and that he needs to rely on his master for help. Now safe from the magistrate and assorted goons, the pair head to Yoshiwara to meet up with Munenori and Tsukinoshin. But on arrival, they find out that local thugs are already looking for Iori because a bounty's been posted on his head. After a quick fight, we meet up with Dayu, who tells us that the way this case is being handled is strange, and that Kakunoshin is known for being underhanded, often framing Ronin for various crimes. They decide the only way to deal with this problem is to catch the real killer, despite knowing that the real killer isn't human and can't be brought to justice, so good luck with that. And then the two head out for a pointless stealth segment. Despite being able to mop the floor with the local goons, Iori for some reason decides that fighting isn't a valid option in this scenario, so we have to run around the whole town in an effort not to get caught, which doesn't even end up working, making the next 10 minutes feel like nothing more than padding. We then meet up with Tsukinoshin, who's happily recommending Yoshiwara's establishments to Munenori, surprisingly the constable's being a total bro for Iori here, slipping him info and helping prove his innocence. Didn't realize he was such a cool dude. Congrats Tsukinoshin, you're officially better than Issei in terms of mostly irrelevant friend characters. you've cleared the lowest bar possible. Meanwhile, Saber confronts Munenori since the swordsman pursuing them apparently used his sword style. This irritates the man as it's supposed to be a secret technique known only to his clan and the Shogun. Before any solid conclusions can be reached though, Samson appears, and he is pissed. Why? Who can say? But it's obvious that someone in the group has wronged him somehow, so they decide to get out while they can. They run all the way to Shinagawa, where the first victim was found. Yori thinks about how Berserker had killing intent, so someone in the group is suspicious. Gee! I wonder who? Yagyu suggests they head to the temple to start their investigation, and our main duo comment on his carefree yet serious personality. Once they head up to the temple, they hear a scream, and it's here that we get access to Yagyu, and honestly, yeah, he's another swordsman. None of his attacks really set him apart that much, and he's fairly bland compared to our last DLC sermon. But, interestingly enough, his attacks do have a theme of darkness with them, which isn't suspicious of a man famous for his swordsmanship at all. What would even make you think something could be up with this guy? And look, spoiler for the ending here in 3, 2, 1. I'll level you guys here. We're already around the halfway point of the story, and this mystery isn't particularly engaging. The most likely suspect travels with us the whole time, and the game isn't subtle with its foreshadowing. Sure, they show Yagyu off as this charming warrior who seeks justice, but come on, if the circumstances they met him under wasn't strange enough, Berserker chasing him down lays it on a little thick. It would be hard to make it any more obvious that he's the killer. But I digress. The man who screamed at the temple is a constable, and as thanks for saving his life, he gives us some info on the victim, another official who is rumored to be corrupt. He then guides our team to a tea house on the other shore where we can get more info. Once we arrive, Yagyu orders 3 of every sweet item they have, finally putting himself on good terms with Saber. The owner then confirms that the victim was in fact a prick, before some thugs show up looking for a fight. One quick beatdown later, and he gives us directions to the man who ordered him to attack Iori. But first, the group takes a moment to think. They realize that all the victims were corrupt officials, so they conclude that Kakunoshin is most likely going to be one of the victims, and that is why he is so feverishly trying to arrest Iori, who he thinks is the killer. But forget that, because we have a man to meet. And said man, on seeing Iori, realizes he can't possibly be the killer, because he's seen the killer, who he describes as being a mountain of a man. But before too much of this mystery can be solved, the group hears that Tsukunoshin in trouble, so they rush to his aid. We quickly get rid of the Yagyu punks bothering him, and one kindly gives us a message. A warrior's Odachi craves only blood. He then runs off, leading the group to ponder his words before they're ambushed by constables. Tsukunoshin tries to distract the constables so the group can escape, and the 3 scatter to throw their pursuers off. While split up, Iori comes across Zhang and Archer, who inform him that another official has gone missing, and that the Onmyoji overseeing the ritual have been on the move covering up magic stuffs. Neither of these things tell us anything about the mystery at hand, though, since we already know about the connection between the victims, and that heroic spirit is the perpetrator. I appreciate the help, Zhang, but your information gathering isn't looking great. While this is going down, Saber runs into Musashi in town, who challenges them to a fight, because Berserker swordswoman likes to fight. They then chat a bit before Saber heads off to meet with the other 2. The group follows the Yagyu swordsman to Nihonbashi, where the missing magistrate Zhang mentioned is. The group splits up to search the town. Musashi just so happens to be here as well though, and Iori runs into her. She gives him some simple advice. If they are evil, cut them down. And if they are good, cut them down. Whoever they may be, when duty calls, cut them down. She then takes off for a nearby food stall, leaving her student to ponder her words and question locals who have so little of interest to say, we don't actually get any dialogue from them. Once again, a group of thugs find and challenge Iori, not understanding that I'm over-leveled as hell. They don't have a chance. Saber then shows up with little to show for their investigation, and we then get to follow Yagyu around as he also fails to gather information. But he does get some charming dialogue with some NPCs, so it stings a little less in his case. On the way to meet back up with the other 2, he comes across monsters that he decides to cut down for the sake of the residents. We also get access to his noble phantasm, which I'll say now might be one of my favorites in this game. It's incredibly simple, but stylistic enough to be fucking awesome. After beating the monsters, he talks about how anyone could reach out and help the people of Edo, and how he once knew a person who did that. He then finds his allies battling monsters in the back streets and lends them a hand. Before talking though, Yagyu senses something and rushes off, where we find a group of Onmyoji confronting the mysterious Yagyu swordsman, who quickly cut down the mages. After kicking them to the term, Munenori apologized to the corpses of the Onmyoji, before finding a paper that has a list of the victims on it. Meanwhile, Iori investigates the body of a nearby magistrate that the Onmyoji were trying to hide. The reason why is blatantly obvious, but Iori is definitely no Sherlock, so he can't quite put together they're hiding evidence of magical events. Munenori then reveals to us that the next target is in fact Kakunoshin, who Iori swears to save for the sake of the path of peace. He wonders why the man is able to command the sword-wielding monsters though, and before they can go off to find him, they are again attacked by Samson. We win the fight and run away, with Yagyu stopping to compliment his might. And once again, it's obvious that Berserker is following Yagyu. You could replace Samson with a neon sign saying, "Yagyu's the killer," and it would have the same effect. We're then treated to a scene of Kakunoshin meeting with the masked figure that he calls his master. He refers to the monster swordsman as his disciples, and it's pretty clear that this masked man is pulling the strings behind Kakunoshin's actions. We then cut back to our group discussing how they will handle trying to save Kakunoshin, since they realize he likely won't listen to them. Nevertheless, all they can do is confront them, and Yagyu suggests they do so with the utmost sincerity. As our main duo rushes off, Yagyu basically confirms he already knows who the masked man is and follows behind. We find the magistrate pretty quickly and try to confront him, but he runs, leaving his swordsman to slow us down. A plan that barely works because these guys are still chumps. When we catch up to Kakunoshin, we discover 2 of them! Saber then puts on their fox masks and chases one down while Munenori and Iori follow the other. We catch up to him pretty quick, but Sukenoshin shows up, apologizing because even though he knows Iori's innocent, he still has to perform his duty as a constable and protect the man. Fortunately, he wasn't lying about his skill with a sword, so the fight's over pretty quick. The real issue is that immediately after, monsters appear, and we have to fight them to protect the normal men here. We then find that the Kakunoshin we followed is in fact fake. Yagyu then takes a moment to comment on Iori's swordsmanship, telling him that he senses the tranquility of the moon as well as a ferocious beast in it. Saber then shows up to reveal that their Kakunoshin was a fake as well, and we all go off to find the real one. Turns out he's off hiding in a hole. We try to convince him that we're trying to help him, but the panicked man runs off calling for his master. This time, constables block our path, and as you might have expected, we cut through them like butter. The group rushes off trying to save the magistrate, but by the time we find him, the masked man has already cut him down. He calls out Munenori, who identifies him as Yagyu Toshinoshi, his nephew and the head of the Owari branch of the Yagyu. He reveals that he's not a heroic spirit, but a simple wandering ghost, who he claims is the killer. Toshioshi sidesteps the question of who the killer is, and we prepare to cut him down. A quick beatdown later, he reveals his true form, a demonic-looking swordsman obsessed with cutting down the Edo Yagyu, claiming Munenori's life is the only one he cares to take. He challenges to a fight in Asakusa and takes off. As the servant companions rush to fight him, Iori investigates Kakunoshin's body, saying something doesn't add up here. Iori questions Yagyu if he knew the whole time that the man they were looking for was Toshioshi, and he confirms he did, and that a rivalry between their groups led to this grudge against him. We then find Toshioshi in Asakusa, where he reveals that he was associating with Kakunoshin to lead Yagyu to him, just so he could settle their little feud once and for all. Despite that claim though, after hitting half health, he just kinda runs off to pad out the DLC just a little bit more, and give Musashi time to show up. She reveals she's been seeking out the killer as well, hoping to get a crack at fighting him. She also tells Saber the reason she challenged them was just to blow off steam from her pointless investigation. They then introduce Munenori and Musashi, and the gang heads off to confront Toshioshi again. After fighting a few monsters blocking our path, we meet up with the monstrous swordsman again, who recognizes Musashi by her bloodlust. He whines a little bit more about Munenori overshadowing him, and the fight begins again. After beating him, Munenori gets ready to strike him down, but not before Musashi appears behind him and calls him out for being the true killer. She then gets Iori to explain what's going on. Naturally, he starts off by talking about swordsmanship, and that Yagyu's was like a flickering flame Iori could barely grasp, which led to him wanting to stay around him so he could understand his nature, and how best to cut him down. He admits to traveling together was just so he could discern that. He compares him to the reflection of the moon, and that he couldn't understand him or ever trust him. Iori knew that Yagyu had been manipulating how things were going all along to get things to the point he and Iori would face off again. Munenori confirms everything he said and reveals himself as the Yagyu Munenori of another world, one where instead of commanding samurai, he commanded ninja, bringing justice from the shadows. He shows them that the mysterious Yagyu swordsmen they've been fighting were part of his noble phantasm, which gave shape to shadows. Unfortunately for him, Toshioshi as another Yagyu was able to hijack the noble phantasm, giving him a reason to seek him out for a fight. Munenori then reveals that he killed the officials because it would bring him closer to what he wanted, that he's just reaching out for what he desires. He asks his nephew what he wants to do, and Toshioshi decides without his actual uncle here, all he really wants to do is fight with his blade. And so, the two Yagyu challenge the Miyamoto swordsman to a fight. They ask Saber to stay out of it and begin one last battle. Before the fight begins though, Munenori reveals that he traveled with the party for the same reasons Iori did, to feel out his enemies. He also reveals that he is in fact the younger version of the Munenori that Musashi fought in the Shimosa singularity of Fate Go. and then our fight begins, and it's not particularly hard. But there's a cool scene in the middle of it where we get a clash between Yagyu and Iori, where the servant claims that the regular swordsman isn't enough to slay him, and Iori simply responds by saying he will cut him down anyway, and quickly ends up doing so. With the fight done, Toshioshi remarks that it was enjoyable before fading away. Munenori agrees as Musashi compliments his swordsmanship, and says that luck was the real decider of the match, refusing to acknowledge how overleveled we were. As our heroes walk away while Munenori's disappearing, he remarks that there's another demon here as he watches Iori leave. We then cut to the next morning, where everything's wrapped up quite nicely. Sukenoshin arrives to tell Iori that his name is cleared, and then he goes off to meet Munenori, who later shows up at Iori's house that evening asking for recommendations on tea houses, leaving Iori and Saber completely speechless. He tells them he basically decided not to disappear, and he agrees to help them out, now that he doesn't plan on carrying out any more murders. They make a simple contract so he can't strike Iori down, and the DLC draws to a close. And man, I just have to say, that was one of the most mediocre things I've ever experienced. Don't get me wrong, there's some gold in here, particularly I like Munenori's characterization, and Sukenoshin ends up being a way better character than I expected. But outside of that, it's just nothing. The mystery plot is hardly engaging, and as soon as Kakunoshin starts acting terrified, it becomes pretty clear that Yagyu's the killer since he's the only real suspect. Not to mention the encounters with Samson, which not only feel like forced padding, but completely give him away. It's also not even entirely clear why he's so pissed off at Munenori. I mean, sure, he killed a guy in Dayu's territory, but if she didn't give the order for him to follow, I doubt he'd be this persistent about it. And it completely undermines later when Toshioshi first shows up to be a red herring for us, since by this point, it should be painfully obvious who the killer is. The issue is that the majority of this DLC is structured around this failed mystery plot, which becomes wholly unengaging when it's so obvious what's going on. It makes every investigation scene, which, by the way, almost always ends up with us discovering nothing and just so happening to overhear plot-relevant stuff we need to go to. It renders all of that useless! And the mystery isn't even the only part of the writing that falls flat here. Musashi's comment about killing Iori hints that maybe there's a theme of justice that would be explored here. But no, nothing's done with that, and that's really the only theme that we might be able to derive from this particular story. So it's totally failing in terms of symbolism as well. Somehow, despite only taking me around 3 hours to beat, half the time it feels like padding, as almost every fight boiled down to enemies show up to stall for time. That works in the main game because we're in the middle of a conflict where various groups have time to prepare and set up defenses to deal with our heroes, which is way less effective when our hook here is so much more grounded and personal, being that Iori is framed for murder. Stakes that, by the way, don't come with a time limit, so just delaying us doesn't really feel like a big deal. And then there's our main adversaries for this DLC, Kakunoshin and Toshioshi, who are both bland as hell and don't even get sprites. I will admit Toshioshi's model is rad as hell though. I seriously want that as a design in Fako. And Munenori himself isn't that interesting as a playable character like I mentioned earlier. He's just another sword guy that doesn't feel that different from Saber. Honestly, I wish I could say better things about this DLC other than I like some character interactions, but honestly, if you skip it, you really aren't missing out on much of anything. It's bland, it's repetitive, it's short, and doesn't really add anything to the greater narrative of Samurai Remnant. I hate to be this negative about it, but I'd be lying if I said it left me feeling satisfied. It's not abysmal by any means. I'd have more interesting things to talk about if that were the case. Instead, it just kind of fumbles at every turn, leaving us with a package that I'll have forgotten in a week. Anyway, thanks for listening to my insane ramblings. If you like this DLC, tell me why in the comments, and see you next time.